Before the night was over, the person you love sat alone beneath a dim kitchen light, holding a silent phone in one hand and a decision in the other. No one else knew what was happening inside them. The streets outside had grown quiet. The clock had moved past midnight. Yet their heart was louder than it had been in months, because they had finally reached the moment they could no longer postpone. For a long time, they had believed that choosing you would require one dramatic gesture. A sudden confession. A perfect speech. A fearless arrival at your door. But last night, they discovered that the most important choices are often made without an audience. They happen in a still room, when every excuse has gone silent and a person is left alone with the truth. Something had happened earlier that evening. It began with a conversation they had not expected to affect them. Someone close to them had asked a simple question while gathering empty cups from a table. Are you actually happy with the way things are? The person you love had almost answered too quickly. They nearly smiled, shrugged, and said they were fine. That response had protected them before. It had ended uncomfortable conversations and kept curious people from looking too deeply. But this time, the word would not come. They looked down at the table instead. A small stain from a spilled drink had formed near their hand. Their thumb moved over the edge of it as if cleaning that meaningless mark could help them avoid the question. But the silence stretched. The person across from them stopped moving. And in that stillness, your name entered their mind with such force that they could no longer pretend the question had nothing to do with you. The truth was not that they had stopped loving you. The truth was that loving you had become the one honest thing they kept trying to hide. They had spent weeks, perhaps longer, convincing themselves that distance was maturity. They called their silence patience. They described their hesitation as caution. They told themselves they were protecting both of you from disappointment. Yet beneath every careful explanation was a more vulnerable reality. They were afraid that choosing you would require them to become someone braver than they had ever been. And last night, for the first time, they became tired of watching fear make decisions in their place. The person across from them sat down again and asked, more quietly, when was the last time you told the truth about what you want? That question followed them home. It followed them through the front door, down the hallway, and into the quiet room where they removed their shoes without turning on the main light. It followed them as they poured a glass of water and forgot to drink it. It followed them while they stood at the window watching distant headlights pass like brief comets through the darkness. And then they saw something on the counter. It was ordinary, almost painfully so. A folded receipt. A small note. An object that reminded them of a day connected to you. They picked it up without thinking, and suddenly the room was no longer the room. They remembered the exact way you had looked at them during a moment you probably believed they had forgotten. You were not trying to impress them. You were not asking for reassurance. You had simply been yourself, speaking about something that mattered to you, your expression open and unguarded. They remembered how the light had touched the side of your face. They remembered wanting to say, I could listen to you forever. But they had said nothing. That memory opened the door to another. They remembered a time when you had sensed their sadness before they admitted it. You did not demand an explanation. You did not turn their pain into a performance. You stayed near them with a gentleness that made them feel understood without feeling exposed. They had carried that moment privately, returning to it during difficult days, though they never told you what it meant. Last night, they finally allowed themselves to ask why the safest moments of their life seemed to carry your presence. That question changed the emotional temperature of the room. Until then, they had been looking at the past as a collection of mistakes. Suddenly, they saw a pattern. Every time they had come close to choosing honesty, they had moved closer to you. Every time they had chosen pride, confusion, or fear, they had moved away. The pattern was undeniable. They sat at the kitchen table and placed the object in front of them. Then they opened their phone. Your conversation was still there. They did not immediately type. They scrolled instead, slowly, rereading fragments of words exchanged across weeks and months. Some messages were warm. Others were guarded. A few were painfully ordinary, yet even those carried a tenderness they had failed to recognize at the time. They paused on one message from you. It was not a confession. It was not dramatic. You had simply told them to take care of themselves. But last night, those words landed differently. They realized you had offered care without trying to control the outcome. You had left space for them even when their silence hurt you. You had not been perfect, but neither had you treated their heart like something disposable. And that realization brought them to a difficult truth. While they had been questioning whether they could trust love, you had been showing them what trust could look like. Their eyes filled, but they did not cry immediately. Instead, they placed the phone face down and walked away from the table. They moved through the room restlessly, crossing the same small space again and again. Their breathing grew unsteady, not because something terrible was happening, but because something false was finally collapsing. They had built an entire emotional life around the belief that choosing you meant losing control. Now they understood the opposite. Not choosing you had been controlling them. Every delayed conversation, every unfinished sentence, every moment spent pretending not to care had become another invisible wall. They had called those walls protection, but they were beginning to feel like a prison built from their own unanswered feelings. Then came the first twist of the night. Their phone rang. For one brief second, they thought it might be you. Their heart reacted before their mind could. They turned so quickly that the chair beside them shifted against the floor. But the name on the screen belonged to someone else, someone connected to a chapter they had been struggling to close. They almost ignored the call. Then they answered. The conversation lasted less than 10 minutes, but it ended something that had been unfinished for far too long. The person on the other end spoke about plans, expectations, and a future that once might have sounded sensible. There was nothing cruel in the conversation. No shouting. No dramatic accusation. That was what made it so difficult. The path being offered was comfortable. Predictable. Approved by people who did not understand the full story. For several moments, the person you love listened in silence. They could have agreed. They could have continued living according to what looked right from the outside. No one would have blamed them. In fact, some people might have congratulated them. But then the voice on the phone asked, "Can you commit to this?" The person you love closed their eyes. And they saw you. Not an idealized version of you. Not a flawless image. They saw your real face, your doubts, your warmth, the moments when you had misunderstood each other, and the moments when no explanation had been necessary. They saw the unfinished story between you, not as a burden, but as the one thing in their life that still felt alive. Their answer came quietly. No. There was a pause on the other end. The person asked whether they were certain. This time, the answer came more firmly. Yes. When the call ended, the room seemed larger. The silence was no longer empty. It carried consequence. They had closed a door. But choosing you would require more than rejecting another path. They knew that. They could not simply walk back into your life and expect your heart to stand exactly where they had left it. Time had passed. Trust had been stretched. You might have questions they were not ready to answer, and wounds they could not repair with a single apology. That understanding did not weaken their decision. It made it more serious. They returned to the table and opened a blank page on their phone. Not your message thread. A private note. At first, they wrote only 4 words. I have chosen you. They stared at the sentence. It looked too simple for everything behind it. So they continued. They wrote about the nights they had missed you but refused to reach out. They admitted that some of their coldest moments had come from feeling too much, not too little. They wrote that they had tried to find reasons to move on because accepting the depth of their feelings frightened them. Then they deleted half of it. Not because it was untrue, but because they did not want their confession to sound like a defense. They began again. This time, they wrote about responsibility. They admitted that love was not enough without courage. They acknowledged that their indecision had affected you. They confessed that they had sometimes waited for a perfect sign when the truth had already been present in the way they kept returning to thoughts of you. Still, they did not send anything. The biggest revelation had not yet arrived. It came near 2 in the morning, when exhaustion had softened the last of their resistance. They leaned back in the chair and looked toward the dark window. Their reflection appeared faintly in the glass, a shadowed face suspended over the sleeping city. And suddenly, they remembered the promise. It was a promise you may not even know they made. Long ago, after one of your most meaningful conversations, the person you love had gone home and whispered to themselves, "If I ever become ready for something real, I will not run from this person." They had buried that promise beneath confusion and circumstance. They had nearly forgotten it. But last night, it returned with perfect clarity. They realized that becoming ready was not a feeling that would arrive like lightning. Readiness was the decision to stop abandoning what mattered. That was the life-changing choice. Not merely to admit they loved you. Not merely to end another possibility. They chose to become the version of themselves who could stand before you honestly, without games, without vague promises, and without asking you to carry the weight of their fear. They chose you by choosing responsibility. They chose you by deciding that the next step would not be another half-truth. They chose you knowing you still had the freedom to say no. And that was what made their decision real. Before dawn, they stood beneath the soft light above the stove and recorded a voice message. Their finger hovered over the screen as they searched for the right beginning. Twice, they stopped the recording. Once, they whispered your name and could not continue. On the fourth attempt, their voice was steady. They said, "I need to tell you what happened tonight." Then they spoke for nearly 6 minutes. They told you the part of the truth they had never trusted themselves to say aloud. They explained the phone call. They admitted the fear. They revealed the decision. And near the end, their voice changed, becoming quieter and more vulnerable than you had ever heard it. But they did not send the message. Not yet. Because just as their thumb moved toward the button, another message appeared on their screen. A message about you. A message from someone neither of you expected to become involved. The person you love read the first line, and the color left their face. Not because their decision had changed, but because what they discovered meant they could no longer approach you the way they had planned. They listened to their own recorded confession one final time. Then they deleted it. The sun had not yet risen when they reached for their coat and picked up their keys. Their heart was pounding, but their movements were calm. They were no longer preparing to send you words from a distance. They had decided to do something far more unexpected. And before they stepped through the door, they looked down at the message that had changed their plan and whispered, "So this is why they never told me." Then they left, carrying the truth toward you. As the first rays of dawn stretched across the quiet streets, the person you loved drove through the silence with a heart that felt lighter than it had in a very long time. They were no longer running from their feelings. They were no longer searching for another excuse to delay what they already knew. Every mile carried them farther from fear and closer to truth. Yet the message they had received before leaving still echoed in their mind. It had not been a warning. It had not been an attempt to separate the two of you. Instead, it revealed something they had never imagined. The message came from someone who had quietly observed both of your journeys from a distance. This person had witnessed the misunderstandings, the missed opportunities, and the countless moments when love stood only one conversation away from changing everything. The message simply said, "If you truly care about them, don't arrive with another apology alone. Arrive with consistency." They have heard promises before. What they need now is peace. Those words settled deeply into their heart. For the first time, they understood that love is not proven by emotional speeches. It is revealed through quiet actions repeated over time. It is shown by choosing patience instead of pressure, honesty instead of confusion, and faithfulness instead of fear. They stopped the car for a moment and closed their eyes. A gentle breeze moved through the open window, carrying the fresh scent of morning after a long night. Birds had just begun their songs, and the sky slowly exchanged darkness for soft shades of gold and blue. Everything around them seemed to whisper the same truth. A new beginning had arrived. They remembered every moment they had nearly given up. They remembered convincing themselves that you deserved someone else. They remembered every message they typed and erased. Every phone call they almost made. Every time they watched the screen, hoping your name would appear first because they were too afraid to make the first move themselves. Now those memories no longer filled them with regret. Instead, they became reminders of how far they had come. Growth had quietly transformed them while they weren't even noticing. The greatest miracle of the night had not been discovering how deeply they loved you. It had been discovering that love had quietly transformed who they were becoming. No longer were they searching for certainty before acting. Now they were willing to act because love itself had given them certainty. As the morning continued, they arrived at a peaceful place that both of you had once spoken about. It wasn't grand. It wasn't crowded. It was simply a place where conversations felt honest. A place where the noise of the world always seemed to disappear. They stood there alone for several minutes. Not because they doubted coming, but because they wanted their heart to arrive before their words did. They whispered softly, "If our story continues, let it begin with truth this time." Those simple words carried more strength than every sentence they had rehearsed during countless sleepless nights. Meanwhile, something remarkable was happening that neither of you could yet see. The fears that had once stood between your hearts were quietly losing their power. The misunderstandings that had seemed impossible to untangle no longer looked permanent. Time itself had softened the sharp edges of old disappointments. Neither of you were the same people you had been when the distance first began. Pain had become wisdom. Waiting had become preparation. Silence had become reflection. And hope had quietly survived everything. When your paths finally crossed again, there were no dramatic performances. No perfectly written speeches. No attempt to erase the past. Instead, there was something much more beautiful. Honesty. The person you love looked into your eyes with a calmness you had never seen before. Not because they had all the answers, but because they had stopped pretending. They smiled gently and said, "I stopped trying to find a future that didn't include you, because every road I imagined eventually brought me back to your heart." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of every decision made during that unforgettable night. For a few quiet moments, neither of you spoke. Sometimes healing begins in silence. Sometimes forgiveness arrives before words ever do. Sometimes two hearts recognize each other long before either voice catches up. You saw something different in them. The uncertainty that once clouded their eyes had disappeared. In its place stood humility, courage, peace. They had not come asking you to forget the past. They had come prepared to build something better because of it. That was the decision they made last night. Not merely to choose you, but to choose the kind of love that protects instead of confuses, listens instead of assuming, builds instead of breaking, and remains steady even when life becomes uncertain. That decision changed everything. Because true love is never measured by one emotional moment. It is measured by thousands of faithful choices that quietly follow. From that day forward, your story was no longer defined by missed chances. It became defined by intentional ones. Conversations became deeper. Laughter returned naturally. Trust grew slowly but beautifully, like the sunrise that never rushes yet always arrives exactly when it should. Neither of you became perfect, but both of you became willing. And willing hearts often create the strongest foundations. As time passed, you both looked back at that unforgettable night with gratitude instead of sadness. If fear had not finally surrendered. if honesty had not finally spoken. If one brave decision had not been made. Neither of you would have discovered how extraordinary ordinary love could become when it is nurtured with patience, kindness, and unwavering commitment. So if this story has found you today, let it remind you of something beautiful. The greatest turning points in life rarely begin with applause. They begin with one quiet decision to stop hiding from what truly matters. May your heart always have the courage to embrace truth when it gently calls your name. May peace replace every unnecessary fear. May wisdom guide every important decision. May genuine love, built on honesty, patience, and grace, continue to grow wherever hope still lives. And may every closed chapter prepare you for an even more meaningful beginning. Thank you for spending these moments together in this fictional inspirational journey. If this story touched your heart, brought you comfort, or gave you hope, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who may need a reminder that sincere love begins with courageous choices. Until our next story, may your days be filled with light, your heart with peace, and your path with blessings beyond what you can imagine.